Welcome everybody to what I think is the last of the Humanities Research Fellowship talks of the year, and I think we're really in for a treat. We're going to go out with a bang. So it's my great pleasure to introduce Chip Rossetti, who's the editorial director of the Library of Arabic Literature series. He has a PhD in Arabic literature from the University of Pennsylvania, where he wrote his dissertation on the Iraqi author Ḥāmid before his second career in academia. He worked for a number of years as an inquiring editor at US publishing houses, as well as the American University in Cairo Press. He has translated a number of works of contemporary Arabic fiction, including novels by Sunala Ibrahim and Ahmed Khalid Tawfiq. Most recently, he translated Mohammed Mazzani's work of eco-fiction, Animals in Our Days, and Dia Jubaili's flash fiction collection. I want to hear more about what that means. No Windmills in Basra. His translation of two recent novels from the Gulf will be published next year: The Cinderellas of Muscat by Huda Ḥāmid and Rose's Diaries by Reem al-Kamali. And I had the great pleasure about 2 weeks ago of having coffee with Chip and hearing a bit about this translation, which is just amazing. And I walked away thinking like, wow, LAL really needs to make a video game adaptation of this. So without further ado, I'll hand it over to Chip.
Thank you very much, Julia. With that introduction, I hope I can live up to half of that. And maybe we can all brainstorm some ideas for the LAL video game series, leg over leg, as a video game or something. But thank you. And thank you to Alex and to Raya for inviting me here to speak as part of this series. I guess I'm delighted to, sort of close up the academic year with the last of these lunch sessions. So I'm going to be talking, as you could probably guess here, as surmised, on this text, the Tuḥfat al-albāb, or Nukhbat al-A'jāb by Muhammad al-Gharnāṭī. The title here of Jinns, Eggs, and Giants' Bones, that's not going to be the final title. But this is the text I'm editing and translating for LAL. As I look around, of course, I see almost everybody here is already familiar with Library of Arabic Literature, but I'm going to, I had a little brief summation of it for those who aren't, and for anyone who might be seeing this recorded at some point. So just bear with me. I'm just going to give a little brief overview, although, of course, you have many of you that were here a couple of months ago listening to David Larson's talk on his project for LAL as one of the fellows, and of course Nas Khansa's talk on her project that she's editing and translating for LAL. But here goes. Just because in addition to translating and editing this text, I also am the editorial director for the Library of Arabic Literature series. So just to jump right in. First of all, of course, this is our logo here at Library of Arabic Literature. It's a bilingual text series. We cover everything from the pre-Islamic period now really up to the Nakhta, so around the turn of the 20th century. And we intentionally keep our list of texts very broad, everything from travel literature, to biography, poetry, poetics, philosophy. We've done a cookbook, fiqh, done all kinds of things. We do try to keep that it really is not just simply an edeb, but al-maktaba al-arabiyya, sort of anything that we really think was part of the written heritage of Arabic that our term is significant works in Arabic literature. Let's see. So, and also, I should mention, we early on realized that we're not simply a translation series, we are an edition translation series. This is one of the first decisions we took back when the series first began in 2010, which was that we were not simply going to produce additional translations of texts that were already out in editions, but to request that scholars who produce these translations also produce, first of all, an edition by examining original manuscripts, collating them, producing their own original edition. It's sort of the easier thing would have been to simply pull editions off a shelf, get permission from another publisher, and say, we'd like to take your editions you've done of this well-known author, and we'll just stick our own translation around it and then match them up. But that, for the long run, it seemed like a better prospect to simply produce our own editions, and these would be LAL editions. So it's ultimately more work, but I think makes the series a bit more enduring. So briefly, we started in 2010 with a 5-year grant from here at NYU Abu Dhabi, but I think before there were even students here, there was the Institute. That was 2010, and it was for, let's get that in here. It was for, we were to produce 35 books over the course of 5 years. That was very ambitious. I don't know if we quite got that in the first 5 years. I will say that number 35 is also interesting. I think there were 35 grants originally given out in 2010, 34 of which I think were for the general sciences or social sciences. I think LAL was the only, this is ancient history at this point, but was the only humanities.
Love you, LAL.
So yeah, still going strong 13 years later. So that was in fall of 2010. I was hired at the end of 2010, started working. In addition to those remit to produce these editions translations, part of the original intent of the series is that we are still published by NYU Press in New York. So we are not simply a printing organization, but we publish our books just to make sure they reach academic audiences and to various academic conferences and cataloging, warehousing, all those somewhat dry but necessary aspects of publishing a book and making sure it gets the right hands of academics and readers and professors teaching course adoptions, things like this, needing books for course adoptions. I'm generally based in New York at NYU Press. I work with a colleague there, and in some ways I'm the liaison between the academics who work on the editorial board for the LAL and my publishing colleagues who are very smart at what they do, but they really don't know much about pre-modern Arabic, and therefore I have to sort of make sure they're understanding which books are going out to which readerships and why, and who's going to be reading what. So they do a very strong religion audience, and they routinely go to things like the American Academy of Religion conference. So that's a natural fit for some of our books that makes sense. But in other cases, it's sort of been a long process of making sure they understand what LAL's needs are and what we're reaching. One other reason why NYU Press was a good fit is that when LAL started, NYU Press had just finished a series of bilingual translations of Sanskrit, of a Clay Sanskrit library. I don't have a copy of the book with me. They were not ever done online. They're very small, sort of Sanskrit. Oddly, it was in Roman alphabet on the left side, so it was sort of transliterated Sanskrit, and English on the other side. Very similar principle, again, sort of a broad array of Sanskrit text. That had closed down by 2009, and so it was kind of nice timing that a year later LAL picked up where we left off. And one of my first things I did on this job was to rehire the person who had been the tech guru for the Clay Sanskrit Library, who was a genius at balancing 2 different texts on 2 different pages. I said, can you do the same thing for Arabic? He said, no problem. He learned Arabic. He's a brilliant guy. He's based in the Netherlands, British, and he's sort of our genius who sort of makes all these books look good and make sure that the English and Arabic kind of balance each other out. So in any case, that is where we are now. We are now supported by Temkeen. We're now in our we're in our 3rd phase of 5-year funding, so hoping to keep going. We have, I don't know the total number of books. I should have done a final count for it in here. We're something up to about 86 books total. That includes both hardcovers and paperbacks. But we are going strong in any case. And then just briefly, I'll just say the general editor of the series, and this was his brainchild, was Professor Philip Kennedy at NYU, who was here for a number of years. This is an older photo of him, but there he is back at NYU Abu Dhabi. He was here for 2009 to 2018. I forget when his last year was here, but in any case, that he was here. And he works with an editorial board, some of whom are around the table today. So Phil Kennedy, who's back at NYU, James Montgomery at Cambridge, Shafik Sharawa at Yale, and 8 board members, all academics. You can see where they're from. Some right here, Anas and Morris. Nobody else, right? Yes. So those are the people who will essentially help us, advise us on what books to take on, to sort of work with editor-translators. And I'll just briefly show, this is just, for those who have not seen our books, this is the bilingual facing page format. Couldn't get the entire thing in there on the screen. In some ways, it's surprising that we are doing a facing page series because that is somewhat an artifact of, we're in the world of Google Books, we're in the world of everything online, ebooks, and yet somehow this sort of facing page translation concept format is in sort of a golden age at the moment. For the longest time, it was only the Loeb Classical Library was the only game in town for this kind of thing, and there now seem to be a number of these other series, LAL being one, the Dumbarton Oaks Medieval Library. That's the Library of Chinese Humanities in the top right there. There's now another, UP is producing something called the Shutang Classical Chinese Library. There's the Murti Classical Library of India, the Itati Renaissance Library. So there does seem to be this kind of this facing page format, which is very print oriented, seems to be in vogue. And I guess LAL is sort of, I think, inspired at least a couple of series that have sort of borrowed a name, and I think they've sort of modeled themselves. I'm not going to name any names, but that's good. We're in the bloodstream now of other people from other fields are taking up this idea. In any case, our general format is this. This is our dark blue hardcover format for the bilingual books. After a couple of years, we realized we were getting a lot of questions from academics saying these books are nice, but I teach undergraduates who don't read Arabic at all, and can you produce books that don't have the Arabic, because I just want to teach them intro to world religions or intro to the Middle East. And that's when I came up with the idea of doing the English-only paperbacks on the right side there, a friendly format to sort of reach sort of a broader audience, I think. We like the dark blues, but I realize they can be a little intimidating if you are not already a scholar of Arabic. So that's where we are with the series. And just our website. So now that we're done with that, sorry, author's names are blurred out there. Ḥāmid al-Gharnāṭī is the author I'm working on, switching out the text itself. He has a number of variants of his name that keep cropping up in different texts. Safadi, of course, al-Wafi bil-Wathayat, and Makari mentioned him, both with different iterations of his various family names. His own text, another text of his, the Murad an Ba'da Taja'ib al-Maghrib, is a further version. The colophone of the asl that I'm using here for my text has yet a different version, apparently in his own hand. So this seems to be, I guess I'm sort of leaving it open. There seems to be some dispute about how many of these should be his full formal name, but I will settle that before the book gets published. But he is generally known as Abu Ḥāmid al-Gharnāṭī. Obviously, his name meaning he is from Granada, originally from Granada. One of his sons was Ḥāmid, and he was born in 1080 and died, 1080, and then died in 1169, 1170. This is a brief timeline of his life and his travels. Obviously, like many from the Islamic West, he ended up in the East, himself also not simply Baghdad, Damascus. It's not shown here, but he also spent time in Aleppo and Khorasan. I was in Damascus twice, but also in central Russia on the Volga and in the city of the Bulgar, among the Bulgar people, and then in the city itself called Bulgar, which is, there's a couple of candidates for what that actually is. And then after that, I guess he was around 7 years old, he was among the Bashkirs, which apparently was misnomer for Hungary. So it seems he was actually in what is now central Hungary. I'm not sure where that actual city was, but he simply refers to it as the Bashkir people, misnomer for the Hungarians, Magyars, and then Bashkir mentions that as the name of the city itself. So it's unclear to me. Maybe I think I need to do some more research here to where he actually was living. And then, by near the end of his life, returned to Damascus and Aleppo, and it was actually in Damascus that he wrote this book. He wrote a few books, as I mentioned. The other book, al-Maghrib, sort of like clarification on some of the marvels of the Maghreb, which also was published near the end of his life. And a few other texts that seem not to have been edited. One, apparently there's a manuscript of one in the Zahariya library in Damascus. But really the two that are extant and are edited are this one and the Maghrib. So he lived quite a long life. This is a text I came to simply because it seemed such a fascinating entree into these sort of far travels. In some ways, he was following somewhat in the footsteps of Ibn Fadlan 2 centuries before, and sort of going up to among the Bulgars, Volga. So I just move ahead. This is the actual title for the text, the Tuḥfat al-albāb or Nukhbat al-ajāb. As with so many Arabic titles, there's sort of a, how would you translate this? I don't have a good catchy translation. Generally for LAL, our rule is to take a, not necessarily go with the literal translation, but I mean, one literal translation of the title would be something like this: the precious gift of choice anecdotes and selected marvels. That word al-bad, that's sort of like the pith of a tree, palm tree there, or hearts. I mean, it's often listed, sometimes it's translated as the gift of hearts, which doesn't mean much, but in the sense of this is the really choice bits, the really good parts in the middle. So this is, that's the title for the text. I'm just going to give a brief overview of the text itself. It's fairly short. It's claiming to be sort of a partly explaining sort of the description of the world. It's not quite as comprehensive. It's not a true cosmography. This is not the sort of al-ard that Ibn Hawqal, but he does kind of pick and choose what he clearly finds interesting. Obviously, starting with the world and starting with the various regions of the world. He never mentions the word clean, but he clearly has that Ptolemaic sort of sense of the regions of the world. And he doesn't outright specify it. So as I said, it's short, it's not comprehensive, but it is where he dives, the topics he finds interesting, he dives deeply into them. And he can sort of go on some interesting tangents that could be a little tantalizing because you briefly touch on something, sounds fascinating, you kind of wish you had footnotes himself, or that you could go and ask him, what does this come from, what are you referring to? And then he's off to the next subject. So that's where we are. But again, description of the world and its inhabitants, both human and jinn. And second one on buildings in the world, so different sort of constructions, many of them sort of antiquities, mostly from Egypt is what he seems to be covering, as well as some other topics. The third chapter is primarily on sea creatures, but it is also a description of various seas, the Black Sea, the Mediterranean, where the Straits of Gibraltar meet, and where the two seas, the seas of darkness beyond. That lengthy subtitle there about the various kinds of naphtha and fire on their islands and the pitch, that is really not the subject of that chapter. I think there was one little sentence about it, yet he decided that's the thing he needs to emphasize on chapter 3. And then chapter 4, for me, I think is one of the most interesting about graves and tombs. It's sort of a chapter on, I would call it proto-archaeology. As much of it is about exploring tombs, finding where their locations are, explaining where, what is laid out. It is very much, although earlier on there is chapter 2 mentions the city of brass. There's a description of the city of brass, that same text. This feels very much in the same mode of this sort of discovering these tombs, reading the plaque over the body about sort of look at me, learn from me what I did in my life. I was so that is one of them, and many of them are some are really genuine horror stories. Some of these ones, there are sort of tales about sort of the dead coming back to life, sort of someone emerging from hell, being dragged back into hell with a chain, texts on sort of a body. They seem to think someone was buried alive. They dig him up, and there's a snake sort of making its way through his mouth, and the sound they heard was the snake's tail hitting the side of the coffin, which they thought was the person they buried the day before still alive, and it turns this horrific. It so frightened the speaker that told the story to al-Gharnāṭī that he fled basically to the Volga River, far off, as far as he could get from his hometown. So that's basically where I'm. The subject of the book, the topics the book covers, which is again is pretty somewhat idiosyncratic. And I will just mention, although I don't have time really to sort of go into much for today, his text, the Tuḥfat al-albāb, was clearly influential because it has a number of, just because of the sheer number of manuscripts that are extant, and the number of later authors who borrowed whole chunks of his text and placed them in. One of the major ones, of course, the al-Qazwini, the Ajab, took sections of his text and cited him. Ibshiti is another one. There are a number of other authors that have that clearly were sort of borrowing from him. So it was a text that got passed around. Was clearly part of the boom of a text after the 12th century. There really were many more of these coming out of the Miri, Cosmini, of course, and I'll leave it at that. And maybe we'll just go into the manuscripts themselves and then talk briefly about the edition and then go into some points on the translation. So I'll start just with the text that I'm using. There are, as I said, a number of texts that are extant in various archives. First one I'm using is what seems to be the oldest text. I've taken it as the Asal. It's in the British Library. Estimates are sort of the 14th, 15th century. It is a fairly clear hand. It's quite well voweled, which is always very helpful, particularly for some of the obscure terms. For texts like this, where he's mentioning obscure locations or words that are not Arabic, it's very helpful to have this kind of vaweling, as you guess. It has a detailed colophon at the back that indicates that this manuscript was copied from a holograph, a manuscript in the author's own hand. It seems to suggest, noting that the copy from which this copy was made was in the handwriting of the author itself. So that's pretty good. The manuscript, it also includes 7 color illustrations, one of which was that on the first slide, that was an image of the lighthouse of Alexandria, which he discusses in chapter 3. So it is unusual in having these sort of full color illustrations throughout. Most of them are bunched in chapter 2. And what is also interesting is that the text refers to the illustrations, to the artwork, saying, here's the Library of Alexandria, or sorry, the Lighthouse of Alexandria, and here is what it looks like, or it's al-Hadiya Surah, sort of. So the text refers to itself. Of the text I'm using, this is the only one that actually includes illustrations. All the others, of course, repeat verbatim, and here's what it looks like, but then there's no illustration. So clearly that was part of the original text, Gharnāṭī's text. We can only imagine the copy this was taken from that had illustrations too, and these were sort of, when this was done, sort of an attempt to recreate the images in the first one. This is the Asal I've taken, the oldest one. And I will just show the colophon here, where as I've mentioned, this is from near the end of this text. The author of the book wrote the author of the book, and the copy from which this copy made, it was in the handwriting of the author himself, Khat al-Mu'allaf. And then so it gives the detail with the author reading out the text to his readers in Damascus in the year 1162. So this was pretty clearly the book, the manuscript that I really seemed to be the best use for the Asal for a variety of reasons. So that was the first one. I'm supplementing it with 3 other manuscripts. This one is maybe the second oldest manuscript that we have, which is held in the Hagia Sophia from the late 15th century. I should mention the Asal has, in addition to having illustrations, the Asal also has a whole section that is not repeated in other manuscripts, which is a description of what I believe is Byzantium, Urumiyya al-Uzma, and it's a description of it seems to be a very, they describe sort of a bridge made of metal, and some people seem to think it's just a reference to the golden horn. To me, that I don't know what that could be, but that it's a description of sort of the city and how there are sort of, it really portrays this city, Urumiyya al-Uzma, as in sort of crisis, because there are a number of, it seems like there's sort of different neighborhoods fighting each other, and each sort of neighborhood has its own gang, or there seems to be sort of some sort of social chaos that's reflected here. And he had said, I learned about this when I was living among the Bashkir, and there were Muslims who would go down to the city, so presumably this is Byzantium, and they reported back to me, this is what the city is like. So I have yet to translate that section, but once I do, I'm going to figure out what exactly he's talking about, what this city of metal, what this bridge of metal is that seems to be flying. It seems like a monorail or something. It's clearly not a monorail. It's something that maybe he misheard, but it seems to be some sort of in-air bridge without entirely metal. I'm not sure. So this is, but it's okay. So that was the Asal. Back to this one, the Hagia Sophia. This has never been used in the previous edition. It's the late 15th century. It was transcribed for the library of the consort of the Mamluk Sultan, Ḥāmid. So you can date this pretty closely from the 1468, 1496 was his reign. His consort was Asalbey, who was clearly the mother of his son, Mamluk Sultan Nasser ibn Qaitbay. So this is really, we know exactly much of how this was produced. And it does have a brief colophon in the back that indicates that it was written by or under the authority of the Mamluk Qansu, who was the brother of Asalbey and then himself a Mamluk Sultan afterwards. So it's a pretty clear hand. It's vowel, but the voweling is fairly haphazard. It's clear that someone was seemed to be just occasionally adding fetas that don't necessarily. So that's not all that helpful, but thank you anyways. I'll just show you the opening on the right side there, the front of the manuscript, and so ornate, and then the end of it, the code from the back explaining it's from Mamluk Qansu, was under his authority. So this is a good one to have. Again, never been used by any edition, I believe. And then the third one is from Bota 1502 at the Bota Research Library, University of Erfurt. The Erfurt has two versions of this manuscript. This is the more legible of the two. There are some pages that are smudged, but it dates to 1110, I guess, which would be 1698. Has no illustrations, but it's missing a few initial folia, but it's otherwise a good comparative source to compare against the first two. And then finally, the fourth one is one of the 5 manuscripts of this text held at the Bibliothèque Nationale, France, and it is Deslan 2170. It's not a great PDF they sent, they gave me, but it is very well voweled and is quite thorough. So I found it to be very, very useful. Again, many of its readings correspond with the Hagia Sophia manuscript. So there's the 4 manuscripts. There are many more, but I realized I could only sort of do so many. I'll just mention the previous editions. This was first published as an Arabic edition in 1925 by the French Orientalist Gabriel Ferrand. He used he used 3 of the 5 manuscripts in the Bibliothèque Nationale. And after he finished his edition, he came across one in Algeria, Fagnan 1549, which was very late, 1811. But it had a separate section that he appended to the end of his edition. So that was the first one, 1925. I will mention, sorry, excuse me. So there were some, obviously this was a first attempt. Later editors have sort of noted the number of errors in his text, but it's useful to have as a point of comparison. Very helpful in his extensive notes. So that's really where he shines. Much later in 1989, there was an Algerian scholar, Ismail al-Arabi, who published his edition of the text in 1989, and it was republished in Morocco in 1993. Adar al-Afaq al-Jadida. It's much more comprehensive. It draws on the British Library manuscript that I'm using and a number of other manuscripts. Drew on the 5 manuscripts that Ferrand used and a total of 9 different manuscripts, some of which were partial. So that is one issue, though, is he simply silently corrects a lot of Middle Arabic that crops up in this text. So it's not particularly helpful. I found his introduction is fantastic, though. He's done a lot of work on the reception of this text by Orientalists and Russian Orientalists in the 19th century, and Sylvester Visasi, and how this was viewed. And actually, he's done much of the work in combing through which authors cribbed from al-Gharnāṭī and where, which is wonderful to have. Makes life a lot easier. So just briefly, I'll just show this as a table of the various blockage there, but the various manuscripts that I'm aware of in various archives, and then sort of by checking off which ones have been used by whom. Al-Arabi used the British Library, as did I on the left side there. So I'm using the 2 oldest ones and then 2 later ones here, the Goth 52 and Deslan 2170. I should mention there was one translation, partial translation of the text. If you see that manuscript held in Palermo. There is one section of the Gharnāṭī that describes Mount Etna in Sicily, and that was that was translated into Italian in 1906, I think, using this Palermo manuscript. But again, it's incomplete manuscript, and it's a very partial one. So in any case, that is everything to do with the manuscripts. So on to the translation itself. I'm right now close to finishing a full draft of the Arabic edition. Having looked at all 4 of these, it needs some revision and checking my notes. But I have a partial translation of English at the moment for chapter 1 and chapter 4. So really we're going back into the middle sections to finish them. I'll just give a few examples of some translation challenges that I've come across with a text like this. There's no shortage of unusual place names, as you can imagine, or unusual obscure words that he's dropping into the text. Much of this involves, as I've discovered, I need to be much better about as a biologist than I thought I ever would need to be in the humanities, simply because he's referring to a number of animal species, describing them, and then, I'm trying to sometimes find, well, what is the analog? What's the name for this in English, and what creature is he describing? So, which is always kind of fun. So just to give you a couple of examples, in chapter 1, he sort of gives a tour of different peoples of the world, and he gives a brief survey of the inhabitants of the Sahara, particularly the Khal, which is his spells this here. This was a reference to Gao, which is over there underlined, and a number of other authors in Arabic use Khal, but sometimes with a kaf, sometimes with a qaf, for the people and for the city. Al-Gharnāṭī describes this. He was never there himself, but describes it as the people, the Khal people. He goes into description of them as hunters, talks about them using bows and arrows, and they get poison from a local yellow snake in the Sahara. They dip its blood into the arrows, and then they aim for the eyeballs. So be very careful with them. He talks about people who take these snakes and they sort of wrap them around them. There's a guy who goes into the souk, covers himself in snakes, and then takes off his clothes, or takes off his shirt, and there he's covered in snakes to sort of scare everyone. And as he puts it, he walks around and asks for money, and basically the merchants will give him money to, like, please leave, take your snakes with you, and if you don't pay up, he'll toss a snake into your shop. I can't. It's an interesting anecdote. I don't know if anybody actually did this, but following that, he gets into discussion about not just snakes, but other animals in the region. One, he talks about goat skin. That's very fine, high quality, used for shoes. So the shoes are so good from this supple, durable goat skin that it can be passed from like grandfather to grandson. Grandson can still be wearing his grandfather's goat skin shoes because they never wear out. This is very impressive. But what he also talks about is a four-legged animal that he calls the lumped. And I'll just sort of enclose the top down the right side. They have an animal called a lumped, which is like a large bull. It has 2 horns like spears as long as its body. Horns extend over the animal's back, and if it stabs the animal with them, it kills the animal instantly. It has a wide neck, and leather shields are made from its hide. They're called lumped shields, taken from the name of the animal. The shields are made of 3 layers of hide. They're light and supple, but they can't be pierced by arrows, and swords have no effect on them. They're as white as paper, and among the best shields there are. They're flat like a loaf of bread and are large enough to cover both the horseman and his horse. So I initially thought this was a reference to the addax, but that animal has kind of curved horns. I then started to look at, well, where would I find the word lumped? Gao at the time, Songhai was the language spoken there. There are a number of Songhai French lexicons out, some online. I was trying to find, was there a word that might actually have some echo, or is there a word that I could trace? Well, the answer is no, I could not. So I really was hoping that there'd be something very close to the word LMT in Songhai that would tell me what this is. I think, though, from this description, the animal really was known as the scimitar oryx, which used to be widespread across the Sahara. It was declared extinct in 2000 in this region of Western Africa, and it's now sort of being brought back. I guess you could say it's kind of like a bull. I don't know if it could stab an animal with its backward-facing horns, but they're certainly long enough And I know there is a record of its skin being used for shields, and which is how he describes them here. I guess you should put 3 layers of hide, I guess it makes a good shield. But that's probably the closest. It's now being brought back in Senegal, although it used to be all the way across North Africa. And in fact, one of ancient Egypt's gnomes, its regions, was the oryx gnome, and it's clearly this animal that they used in their illustrations in this administrative region of ancient Egypt, the scimitar oryx. So again, that's kind of one of these sort of long wormholes you find yourself digging into, going into Songhai lexicon online to see if you find the name of an animal, and then coming up short anyways. So I'll mention a few other, just briefly, another places that sometimes occasionally stump me, which is chapter 3 is all about the seas and about sea creatures, but it obviously sometimes dips into other things as well, to other descriptions of animals, including birds, and it includes this description of a bird along the Nile. I also saw on the Nile a bird with a white head and a black body called the Nile eagle, similar to the vulture in size, flies over the Nile and then hurls itself down into the water, emerging with a giant fish in its talons. They say it's the Nile's most delicious kind of fish. It soars into the air with it. Birds gather around it to eat some of the fish it carries in its talons. This eagle cries out, "God is above the Most High," in clear speech that people can hear from a great distance. It's a species that is abundant along the Nile in Egypt. Well, this is clearly not, this bird is no longer on the Nile, but it is mostly in sub-Saharan Africa. It's the African fish eagle. And I have a clip on YouTube here, and I'll let you see if you can hear Allah, folk al folk, the bird's cry. You can kind of see from the way the bird positions its head why people might say this is what it's saying, but I'll let you be the judge. Let's see if I'll, as loud as possible here. Second. Load it up. Oop, no sound. Try this again. All right, it's not. If I unplug this for a second, can I play it again? See if it does play. Let me unplug it from the screen. Play that one more time.
That's a stretch.
Allah, folk al folk. It's going all the way up to the looking up to heaven. So that's that would seem to be the most. There we go. The most likely candidate. All right. So this bird is now only in South Africa and Namibia and Zimbabwe, really far south of Sahara. It's nowhere near the Nile in Egypt. So those are 2 examples of sort of species that sort of sent me down a little, scurrying to find sounds of eagles on the Nile. Perhaps the species that sort of is much more frequent in the text is the jinn. And they crop up and obviously in quite a bit of sort of the Suleiman is in here, so these ruins that he comes across in Egypt and in Alexandria, and, buildings they built. What he describes early on in the text is in chapter 1, goes into specifics about their origins and the different varieties of the jinn. I do need to look further into this, but I thought I'd just share some of the interesting, if anybody's more of an expert on jinn varieties than I am, please come up afterwards and we can talk. So he skips from discussion of the cultures and rulers of China and India into a discussion of the creation of the jinn, saying that he read in an ancient book that God originally created one male and one female jinn, and that female jinn had laid 31 eggs, and she roosted on them. The verb is al-Gharnāṭī, which I guess is the same word that is used for hens sitting on their eggs. And here we go. She sits on these 31 eggs. The first one cracks, and out of it comes a little creature called a kutraba. And this is a dialogue between the kutraba, who's hopped out. The mother jinn is a bit confused. Who are you? And she said, I'm kutraba, the of Taqarib. Kutraba You've called me, so command me as you will. Kutuba, why were you created? Kutuba replied, I was created to sit on these eggs and scatter them when they hatch. And do so, said the female jinn. So this is sort of this little kutuba takes over and sitting on the eggs. So the 30 eggs that are left, when they hatch, out of each egg comes 120,000 jinn, 60,000 male, 60,000 female in each egg. He doesn't list all 30, but he lists, I don't know, 12 or whatever that 50, 14 of the different varieties, 60,000 male, 60,000 female, Iblisa. These others, the Sa'al. Some of these I have to sort of do more research here. What are these varieties? That was the Hul. I think you can understand what a Hul is. Hawaii is sort of a strange word. It's one of the manuscripts calls them Hawaii, which is air jinn of the air. But Hawaii seems to be the spelling. I'm not sure what a Dahadish is. And then some of these clearly have names that are references to what kind of jinn they are. The Hamania, Sahabia, obviously Ifrit, that's no surprise. Dukhania, the smoke jinn, Nadia, fire jinn, brass jinn, or copper jinn, I guess, and Dahbaniya, and the Rihiya. The last one that comes out that he mentions is the Zawada, which he describes in his text as the jinn who spin around in whirlwinds and dust in desolate places like windmills. And it's in Lane, it's in dictionaries. So this is the Zawabia is plural. And it's an interesting, what I'm curious about this is that there's another Andalusi author from the century before. This is Ibn Shahid, who said that the Tawada was Zawada, which is about the epistle on the attendant jinn and the whirlwind jinn. And he was in Cordoba, and this was his text that was clearly written, I think seems to be when he was a young man. It's sort of, it's less on the varieties of jinn, but it's sort of it's been compared really to the Rossetti of Ghufran. We only have it as an extract in which the author describes his own personal jinn, taking him to the valley of where the jinn live, and each famous dead poet has his or own jinn, and he sort of meets these sort of jinn, who are the sort of the spirits that influence these dead poets. So it's interesting that Tawada was Zawada as a title. I would imagine he was familiar with this text as an Andalusi, perhaps. I don't know. I mean, it was about a century before he lived, but it's tempting. It's interesting. And again, it's a pity we don't have the full text, but only an extract with a few chapters. So in any case, those are the variety of jinn that he talks about, the Gharnāṭī talks about in the text. Of course, jinn show up elsewhere as well. It also show up in the section on the city of brass and sort of jinn coming out of the bottles from the lake, and there are smoke jinn and brass jinn and gold jinn and I think silver jinn. So in any case, that is the jinn. I'm just going to mention one other major element here. There's so many things I could talk about. I'll just limit myself to this. The one sort of through line for this text is Gharnāṭī. In most of the chapters, he talks about the nation of Ad, the sort of Quranic tyrants, pre-Islamic tyrants, who Hud was the prophet sent to them. They show up throughout his text, the beginning, and in sort of a folkloric sort of presentation, part of a story about the Ad. And then by the end of the book, he's linking them to his own experiences among the Bulgar and among the Bashkirt in a certain way. I'll show you. So he gives their first appearance in the text is as here we go. First just mentioned as relatives to the Nisnas, the sort of the creatures that are sort of one leg, one arm, sort of like were distant relatives of Ad and Thamud, who live on the shores of Yemen, are kind of these kind of silly hopping creatures with not kind of said they have no minds. There's the Aql, and then of course he gives the whole section on the construction of Iram, of the columns by their tyrant King Shaddad, who rejected Hud as the prophet. Much later then, in the section on tombs, chapter 4, he has quite a bit about Ad, describing not only Hud's tomb in the area known as al-Aqaf. Here, I think it's maybe Oman or something. We're not sure, but they describe the entering his tomb, seeing the tablet, the poem that is at his head where his body is buried, and then goes into descriptions of the tombs of Shaddad and Marthad, both kings of the Ad. Shaddad was the tyrant king. This was the race of oppressors who were giants, and first Shaddad's body is in state, and you can kind of see if you go down into his tomb, there's sort of a poem on a plaque at his head explaining, look, I was the tyrant of Ad, but now I'm gone, and all my glory is for nothing. And then his son Marthad, who was also king of the Ad after him. Later in the chapter 4, as you'll see, he talks about al-Gharnāṭī talks about coming across these bones of the giants, the Ad people, who in one of the stories he talks about how Shaddad and the Ad were sort of scattered and ended up in much more northern climes near where the Bulgar are and where the Bashkir. And when he himself was living in those regions, how a Bashkir friend of his shows him a giant partial incisor of what must have been an enormous creature. Was this a mammoth bone? Was this a dinosaur bone? We're not sure, but it was a huge thing presented to him as the incisor of one of these long dead giants of the race of Ad. And then he also, I'll share this text here. Another friend of his actually has an upper arm bone of a giant in his house and showed it to him. He talks about this massive arm, 18 cubits long. Each rib, I'm not sure where the rib comes from, is attached to the arm, as big as a marble tablet. It's 3 spans wide. And he showed me half of a giant's wrist bone, some of which would be eaten away while buried in the ground. Part near the bottom of the wrist was in good condition, but even then I didn't have the strength to pick it up with one hand, but had to use both my hands. So he is describing these as these were presented to him. This is from the tribe of Ad, these tyrants on the earth, long dead, died around in the far north, and now his friends among the Bashkir have collected them and are showing them at their house. So there are some interesting sort of personal anecdotes about his life, friends he's met up in the distant climes. He also mentions in the text, I should do the digression myself, he talks about he had a young son. He married in the north in the Bulgar, and his infant son died in the middle of the winter. And he says, in that cold climate, of course, you cannot bury bodies in the earth until the earth thaws. And so basically, his dead son had to be kept in a building with the other dead bodies until March or something, and they could finally bury the bodies. And it's a fairly, touching, kind of sad story. He also talks about among the Bashkir in Hungary, his son Ḥāmid, from who is his technical name, married 2 women of the Bashkir and was still living there. So he returned to Damascus, to Aleppo, to Khorasan, and his son remained with his family in Hungary. So clearly there was some small Muslim community in that part of the world. But back to this. This is his text about encountering Bashkirs having an arm bone of the giants. Lastly, the final sections back here, he talks about, it goes from fairly serious talk about bones of giants to sort of people he met among the Bulgar when he was living there. He described someone who, he said, I knew a giant in the Bulgar when I was living there. He was descended from Ad. He's not described as a bad person. He's just this giant man. His name is Dunki, was his name, and he basically had like a cook pot for his helmet when he went to war. There was only one hammam to go to in the city because he couldn't fit in the doors. They had one specially made for him. I came up to his waist. He said he was enormous, and he said, he had a sister who was also a giant. They were both descended from Ad, and he said, she was a very nice lady. They were both very nice people. She was married to a regular-sized Bulgar, and he tells us matter-of-factly, she embraced him and smothered him to death, broke his ribs, and her husband died instantly. Because it's presented as sort of like kind of low comedy. She accidentally kills her much smaller husband. So it's again taking that for what it will. It's a surprising insight into this author. The other last insight I'll just mention about this author in his chapter on sea creatures, He not only describes things he's seen, he's been on boats, and pointing out to him, look, the name of that whale is the X, Y, and Z. He occasionally will talk about encountering sea creatures when he's standing on the shore or on a jetty, and he's standing there on a little, what seems to be sort of a squid or something, a little octopus brings its tentacles up from the bottom of the, underneath the wet rock, grabs his foot, and he's clearly so disturbed by this, and gets out a little dagger he has, and he's trying to stab the thing to sort of get it off, and it's clearly, it seemed, I mean, it really comes across in the text, he's sort of grossed out by this sea creature that's sort of grabbing him. Similarly, he talks 2 instances, and he repeats these stories in his other text, the Moderator by the Jack by the Manuscript, about standing on the shore and seeing on the water coming up onto the, washing up onto the shore, what looks to him like oranges, a bunch of oranges. He said, "This is great. This must be, a boat must have just passed by with transporting oranges from some warmer clime, and it fell off the deck. And isn't this great? Lucky me, I get to have some oranges." And of course, he takes it up, and the oranges are in fact some, I don't know, whale eggs. I don't know what, I'm not sure what kind of creature would have this, but he describes this sort of horrifying realization that what he thought was going to be delicious orange turns out to be a creature or some sort of some part of a creature that he's come across. Similarly, with he comes across a bunch of grapes. He finds again, he keeps finding these things. The grapes turn out not to be grapes, turn out to be something else, eggs or something. In any case, this is Tales Out of School by our friend al-Gharnāṭī. I'm going to leave it there. I will just mention, just to show you from the asl, the 7 images that illustrations that are included in the text. And this is an extra challenge for LAL because we do facing page translations, editions and translations. It would be great to include these illustrations, but they're in color. And of course, when you have facing page translations, you sort of have to keep things equal. So you can't simply stick an illustration on one page, and it just becomes logistically an issue. So this is going to be something we're going to have to work out how we might be able to include these. This seems to be the idol of Cadiz, which a number of authors, language authors refer to. This is a statue that may have been Phoenician. Some people seem to think was in black stone and was seen to be pointing out to the Atlantic. So it's on the Spanish shore. It was gone within a couple of centuries, but he's not the only author to have mentioned this. It's not a great image there, but it's this is the idol of Cadiz. This again is the lighthouse of Alexandria that he discusses. It's a nice image there. He describes in great detail entering inside the lighthouse, how you can go in, the different rooms and chambers, and coming out the other side. So it's clearly something that he personally did himself. This is not this is his own sort of travelogue here. And then describes Ein Shams, what is the obelisk, the Heliopolis. But as you can see, this was by someone who's never seen an obelisk before. This does not look very ancient Egyptian. I think the real, if I had to criticize this artist, I would say the first thing, the top of it is, let's see, it's there's an image of a man on it. Well, I think that would mean an image of a man carved on it, who's sitting on a throne, eating the rising sun. We could all imagine an Egyptian sort of pharaoh sitting in profile, facing the sun. I guess man on it, this artist interpreted to mean there was a statue sitting on top of what looks like a European castle. But that clearly it's a reference to the Ein Shams at Maqariya, as the obelisk that's still there today, I believe. Of course, pyramids. It's a nice shot of pyramids with starlight and moon. He also describes and includes an image of pyramid of Meidum, which is sort of a stepped pyramid, but it is not like this. This seems to be a suggestion. Again, the artist was just clearly taking his cue from the text. The topmost level is like a fortress sitting on a mountain, and he basically did a stepped pyramid with a little castle sitting on top. I'm not sure that's quite how Meidum looks. I should have downloaded a picture of one to compare, but it certainly doesn't look like this. And then in Ardabil, in Caucasus, I guess in Azerbaijan. I think this description of this unusual black stone. I saw a black stone, so it's a black stone that made a clanging sound like steel when struck. It left a mark on a touchstone like that left by tin in the shape of a cow's kidney. It weighed more than 200 nān. Special property was that if there was a drought, they placed it on a cart and brought it into the city of Ardabil, and then it would rain. The rain would continue until the stone was taken back out to the field. So this is a rain stone. There's sort of a instance of one. The Mongols had this as well. So that's that. And then finally, this image of what is clearly a swordfish. And he has a great description of this lengthy swordfish and how you can eat it. It's grilled and served over rice, just like grilled pigeon. Tasted in every kind of meat that's eaten throughout the world. Rice is served on with is more delicious than the rice served with fattened chicken. This is how it looks. So again, this text references these images. They were clearly part of the original text. And are meant to be part of the text, not simply add-ons. But again, the Oslo is the only one that has these full color images. So I think I'll end it there. I hope I've left enough time for questions. And thank you.
Well, thank you so much for this really rich text and sharing this, rich talk and sharing this amazing text with us. I'll just kind of, because I think there's some people in the room who I haven't got a chance to meet. My name is Julia Stevens. I'm a historian. I mostly work on South Asia and the Indian Ocean in the 19th and 20th century, and I mostly work in Urdu. So that's really in way of saying I'm in no way an expert in this area. Nonetheless, found it really fascinating. So I just had a few questions that sort of come a little bit from kind of hearing this talk from a kind of non-expert perspective. And I just wanted to ask Chip a little bit more about the interplay between the sort of natural and the supernatural in the text, because that really kind of came across very strongly in your talk, that Gharnāṭī is really interested in the non-human, and it almost feels like for him nature is enchanted and the enchanted feels very natural. And so just kind of a little bit more about how you kind of understand the way in which he kind of thinks about the non-human, in which they're really, like, we might impose this boundary between the natural and supernatural, but whether that is even a boundary for him in his kind of the way he views the world. This question may be a little bit from the perspective of a modernist, but in listening to you talk about this kind of genre of the kind of literature of wonders, of ajaib, and the way in which this text then influences other texts in the 12th century, I was kind of thinking about the role of the Safarnameh in the 19th and 20th centuries. And I don't know if this is too far afield, but sort of what is the relationship, when do we move from the literature of of marvels into the Safarnameh, which is a kind of more rationalist text? And you mentioned that Gharnāṭī does, people are interested in him in the 19th century, and so maybe that's kind of an entry point into kind of thinking about how like the genre of the travel narrative kind of evolves in the very kind of long array. I wanted to ask a little bit about, and you don't have to answer all of these questions, but I'll just throw them out there, sort of how you work as a translator, and in presenting the material, we get this kind of deep dive into kind of all of the different kind of possibilities that you have to kind of consider when encountering like a term that you don't know what it means. But then how do you kind of render that when you create the final translation? And we spoke a little bit when we had coffee about, wanting to produce translations that don't necessarily always appear to be translations and aren't kind of like, only for people who already know Arabic and have this kind of huge scholarly apparatus. But I'm kind of wondering, in these particular examples in which you have to do guesswork and you're not even maybe sure about how to translate a word, how do you kind of handle that in creating a text that is accessible? And then kind of as an extension of that, I was really interested in your discussion of how technically you produce these facing page translations, but then how that's also creating certain like challenges in terms of incorporating illustrations. And from what I understand, the kind of production of these PDFs of facing pages that then can be downloaded, they really kind of mimic the book form as a kind of like physical paper medium. And now, you know, sort of 13 years into like publishing the series, are you beginning to kind of think about playing with format, and particularly in delivering the books in electronic format? You know, is there any discussion of moving away from just a kind of like a stable PDF that kind of like almost you envision someone printing it and then interacting with it like a book, whereas something that might be kind of more dynamic, you could do things like embed your bird cry within the text. And so I was sort of curious about whether there's kind of any discussions around sort of like reading books in electronic format, and what possibilities that might kind of open up for kind of more multimedia engagement with the text, which you kind of so richly kind of gave us access to like through your talks. So I'll kind of throw, you can pick and choose.
All right, well, that's a lot, but let me see if I can catch at least some of these that you mentioned. Let's see, the division between the natural and the supernatural. I mean, for al-Gharnāṭī, these were all reflections of God's creations, some of which is sort of accessible to human intellect and understanding, and some which is beyond it. So yeah, some of these are clearly, just describing the various peoples of the Sahara, even if it's secondhand. It's certainly things that are, or describing various whales and fish that have been either described to him or that he saw. There's that much more real world, if you will, kind of what we would consider, this is tangible things that you can actually see. There are, but of course, yes, there are places that clearly he veers off into storytelling and just dips to narrative, and it's not even a pretense that this is something I saw or heard about. It's just, now let me tell you about the city of brass, which is, by that point was a well-established trope. This sort of city of brass with Jinn and sort of related to the, in some sense, to the Islamic conquest of North Africa. I think Ibn al-Fatih was the first earliest instance of the city of brass, to give one example, trope. So yeah, there are certainly things where he's clearly dipping into sort of contemporary real history, and then sort of this somewhat Quranic history that's sort of beyond. He talks about Gog and Magog, Yajuj and Majuj, Zulkarnain, Quran, and Zulkarnain crossing a river of sand in North Africa. He touches briefly on things of, it seems to be sort of a tribe of sort of Amazons in the desert in Morocco. That is all women. They become pregnant by immersing themselves in water, and we're sort of it is this kind of Amazonian tribe. And then that's all he tells. I mean, sounds fascinating. I'd love to know more, but I've heard nothing more about that. I've found nothing more about this. So yeah, so that's clearly there are things that are completely supernatural, even to him would seem beyond human understanding. But again, it just, in some ways, I guess we have to understand what we think of that division, natural, supernatural. It was all part of, it's the makhlukat, God's creation. The Safarnama, Nasr al-Khusra, which was
contemporary.
Yeah, I mean, much more. I mean, there are some, obviously, he was also in Egypt, as was Gharnāṭī. So there are some, and he was not the only one to describe the going into pyramids and visiting some of these sites. But it's, I think the real shift was you started much earlier geographic texts. They talk about Edibization of this sort of travel literature or cosmographical literature, where you have much earlier, you have sort of Khudazbe, these sort of measuring the distances between cities and regions. That's much more grounded in sort of, this is what the Basque state needs to know, and we're going to tell them for tax purposes, here's all your realms. And then by Gharnāṭī's period and later, then you see this much explosion of this much more interesting, in this sort of veering into what we would call narrative, what we would call fiction, for lack of a better word. But that's not something I've really, and much of an expert on. I wish I could say more, but yeah, he clearly is. He has one foot in both worlds, and sort of here's what I've seen, and here's a cool story that I think you'd find interesting. That is myth. That's sort of interesting. In some ways, he reminds me very much. before I did Arabic, I was a classicist, so Herodotus is the person that brings to mind. Where Herodotus is partly talking about, here's what I saw, here are places I visited, I went to this tomb, I went to this site, and then also, here's my story about that, it's clearly a wonderful story, but it's, has the feel of folktale, and many of these that he's dipping into have the feel of folktale. But others are very grounded in his own experiences, obviously, in the Caucasus, in the Volga. And just briefly, I'll just mention, all our books are print books. We do sell ebook versions of these, and mostly, I think what we sell mostly are the paperback ebooks where someone just wants the translation. So we haven't dipped into things like what they call in book publishing bells and whistles, which was 20 years ago when ebooks were new. There was this whole sense that when you download an ebook, you would not just see the book, but you get all kinds of things, and it can, sing songs to you, and African fish eagles, which is still possible, but I think people have sort of moved away from that. Although, possibly something like a accompanying website, I think is how a lot of books sort of, if you like what's in the book, here's a website with other interesting things, and there's certainly no shortage of them. So I don't know. I will, when I finish the translation, I'll turn to that. Thank you.
So I'll open up the floor.
I actually, just to jump in, I wonder about this point, because I just think about the natural supernatural, and I worry about the temporalization of it. It makes me wonder to what extent Muhammad is up to something special. Because when I look at travel literature before and after him, everything from Joubert to Bakuta and then beyond, and I don't find the supernatural as prevalent as this is. This is weird to me. It's reminiscent of some of the early chronicles of Al-Andalus, perhaps, where they describe the table of Solomon being discovered, or the tower that you open up and you find the images in it that foretell the coming conquest of Al-Andalus. The stuff that actually floats into some versions of the Knights. It moves in and out of history and the Knights beautifully to illustrate the porousness of the nature between those two. But in travel literature, because he's going out there. He's got some crazy stuff that it's not just he's saying, I heard somebody tell me the story. He's like, yep, and I held the giant's wristbone with my own two hands. I'm like, dude, what's going on? This is unusual.
He's talking about it as a friend of his, so that would seem to be, whatever kind of bone he was holding, whatever he was presented with, and maybe he was gullible, maybe his friend was pulling his leg, but that seems to be, to me, someone he knew showing him something. But it's true, yeah, a lot of it is kind of veers into.
I guess I just wanted our modernist colleague not to think that all of us pre-modernists are indulging our desire for wonders, because I think it's more complicated than that, perhaps. I don't know.
Yeah, no,
I wish I had better data to give a more productive insight.
One possible answer for you, Justin, is that this is an example of pre-modern paleology, which is a hard word to say paleography too many times, but legit dinosaur bones found in antiquity. Adrian Mayer, do you know this amazing independent scholar? Do you know?
Yes, yeah, classically. Yeah.
So she, speaking of Herodotus has a tale that the bones of Orestes were found somewhere on the Peloponnese, I want to say.
Okay.
And her thesis is that these were dinosaur bones. She even has the evidence, the cover of her book, it's like a vase painting with a legit fossil, like an unmistakable head of something.
Yeah.
Maybe the best thing from her book I remember is that in Ellis, in Olympia, where the foot race was run, the whole thing at the stadium is you had to go up around the tomb of Pelops. Now, Pelops was famously eaten by his father. What was his father's name? Sorry?
Tantalus.
Tantalus, yes. And the only thing that he earned
was the shoulder bone.
The shoulder bone, yes. And so the shoulder bone was like displayed on this tomb, and the thought is that it was like a pterodactyl. But if you're in tune with Adrian Mayer, you're so ready for this.
Yes, no, yeah. It is known, because this is so central. It's really somewhat farther east, but central Russia in the early modern period, there was just new bones that were presented to Western merchants who were visiting Novgorod or Moscow, were being shown these giant bones from this new creature called mamant, which we now know as the mammoth, but they were from Siberia, and they've been discovered in such quantities that we have several instances in 15th, 16th century memoirs of merchants talking about there's this giant old creature, massive tusks and massive bones that were presented to me. It sort of became kind of a trope that it's sort of that was sort of an earlier version of, again, similar kind of, this is a couple centuries earlier than that, but the idea that there are these giant mammoth bones floating around, it's now Russia, and being presented to foreigners as take a look at this. Clearly in the 16th century, this was now sort of, yeah.
And that would be my follow-up question. Has he seen the bones of Gog and Magog, or he knows where they are?
No, he gives the standard text about their tribe beyond the wall that Zulkarnain built, and at the end of the end of the world, the wall will come down, and Ya'juj and Ma'juj will come over the wall and destroy us all because they've been loosed. They will be loosed upon humanity, and we're all doomed. But
That story can be from Quran as well.
yes, yeah, and he fleshes it out. Obviously, a lot of these are the Quranic sources, and then they sort of over time they accumulate more detail, I guess. But yes, it's true.
Oh yeah. I guess it's around this. I was thinking a little bit about teaching Ibn Fadlan. I'm a big fan of Nasser Khosrow. I think he's like an absolute literary genius. One of the things that he does, which actually could be a subgenre if one even wants to talk in those terms, but he's a great ironist. And I was kind of thinking about this actually, the kind of irony. It's the irony for Nasser Khosrow. It's often the irony of the people he's dealing with are not nearly as cultured as he is. And this comes up a lot in the Arabian Peninsula. She'll talk about how, I was there and there were these tribes and they were warring with one another, and all of it was over like a couple of date palms, etc. And then he sort of talks about the wonder he would produce as he wrote these. He was asked to write an inscription on a mosque in Arabia, and he writes something, and everyone was awed. Now, of course, this is for a different kind of consumption. This is like for local consumption elsewhere. And he's sort of producing these kinds of stories, often with that in mind. And actually, it's funny because I haven't actually, I think to some degree, although Ibn Fadlan is a special case of kind of like, I think he demands almost a kind of like multiple layers of reading almost. There's an inside, there's an outside. They don't understand us, but they know things that we don't know. It's a more like a kind of almost it's in this sort of weird position towards the Abbasid Empire. But I don't actually, as we talk about bones and this kind of, it's what do you make of this? I mean, he's producing this text presumably around people who have he has a sense of adab. There is an adab, but often that ironic distance towards autopsy, like it's sort of like, oh yeah, I saw all this stuff, but I mean, come on,
he's remarkably free of that kind of
yes.
Sort of like the hicks who were, I was in the sticks and these idiots out there. He seems, he takes
interesting.
Everything is sort of face value. There's another story he tells about, in chapter on tombs, a place that was sort of a shrine near Granada, Loja, I think it's the name of it, and it's about 30 kilometers west of Granada. There's a mountain that people go up to, and you go into a cave, and there are bodies that are essentially mummified. And he basically says, no, this was the Seven Sleepers. I know people say it's Ephesus, but it's over here in Al-Andalus near my hometown. And he said, people go in and they sort of, they pray there, they dress the bodies up, and they put new clothes, garments on these bodies that are sort of in place and position, and one's sitting up and one's sitting down. There's a dead dog, and they've all sort of been mummified. And he said nobody really knows where they're from, but we think this is the Seven Sleepers. but again, on it, just very, very straight faced. And again, he's not sort of really having one eye towards his interlocutors back in Damascus, who clearly were very, educated sheikhs and that he moved in those circles. Yeah, so I haven't seen that kind of looking down. I mean, I'm thinking Ibn Fadlan has that great incident where they're stopped by this basically, semi-barbarian beggar who's holding them up, like, okay, I'll let you go if you give me some bread. Yeah, okay, go ahead, and they kind of let him go on his way. But the implication there is he's making himself out to be kind of a bold warrior, but really he's a very hungry man wanting a piece of bread. So something to eat. That's, and again with Herodotus, that's the same thing. Like, either was he just very naive, or was he just sort of taking it off face value, or is he pulling our leg? Was he in on the joke, or was he sort of, is Herodotus as naive as he seems to come across? And in some ways, this too, he presents it all things I've seen, and now here's a great story that, it's also on simply on kind of on not quite one register, but not at different levels of here's one you can believe and here's one I don't believe. But he does open the text with saying, the wise person will not disbelieve things because he hasn't seen them with his own eyes. So essentially, it's sort of a preemptive, like, please don't make fun of me, or please don't call me a liar because some of these things don't seem believable. A rational person won't say something like that, but so he's trying to sort of protect himself ahead of time.
Yeah, just
Go back to your question. It started with I have also 3 questions. Actually, about your question, like the wonders and the things he could claim to be a witness to what happened. Qazwini has an interesting section, because Qazwini is someone who heavily borrows from Abu Ḥāmid's book. Actually, surprisingly, really heavily in certain sections. It's almost all from Abu Ḥāmid. He tells us that sometimes you do quote something that you know is not true, but somehow by quoting it, you're not accepting its lack of truthfulness. So they do think about this question that you just asked and just replied to. They do kind of, ask themselves and explain to the reader, sometimes more explicitly than other times. But to me, comparing this book to his other book, al-Ma'rif fi ba'd gharaib al-Maghrib, which I told you before, it does not look like a complete book, right? It looks like a draft with scattered
It's a bit
things.
hodgepodge, yeah.
It's fascinating. But to me, in that book, there is so many, like, these small segments that are quite aesthetically, like, fascinating and also very performative, right? Like, there is one when Adam is being pulled out of heaven, Zulman. Like, it's not fair, but we don't know how it's not fair. And Adam's holding onto the plants, and then finally he's pulled and thrown into earth, and that's how we have flowers. Like, because it's so. But to me, like, there are certain sections that are meant to be highly pleasurable, highly literary and performative, and then others that are not. So it's speaking to different registers in terms of. So my question to you, like, what do you think comparing these 2 books? It's very different.
Yeah, I mean, obviously there's overlap. There's it's the other text that Moderator has supplements or expands sometimes, or essentially tells the exact same version of the story that's in here. I think that was really, so good in my first book, I gotta use it again in the other book. And other times he goes into some more detail. But yeah, I mean, even here, of course, in the text, there are, subheadings that explain, like, okay, this is the hadith of the Lake of the Jinn, where, that's part of the city of brass. He sort of, by the way, it's almost like he's saying, all right, now here's a little break. I'm going to tell you this interesting story. Okay, now back to where we were, back to, more interesting facts. In some ways, it's almost Jahizian in its sort of digressions. It's the Torah. And by the way, speaking of which, now let me just bring you over here. So in some, it's it just seems kind of going in various directions, and it is hard. I mean, I would say the odd rather odd, seems to be kind of a through line. That's the one thing that does seem to be somewhat consistent, that sort of, I'm not sure what that implies about the text itself, but I think, I mean, this text, the Tuḥfat has a section on Mount Etna in Sicily. Moderator also talks about that, about someone who devised a way to put a ladle into the volcano to get lava. He said, yeah, but by the time before I got anywhere near the lava, the ladle melted. So unfortunately, we couldn't scoop up lava. And, I don't know what he's going to do with it, but yeah, too bad. The ladle melted. I guess that's what happens with lava. So, but it is, it is interesting. He does seem to switch between the very personal, what I saw, and then here's a fascinating story. Take it as you will. He has, I mean, just speaking of other, just occurred to me another animal he talks about is what he calls the Jewish fish. It's not really a fish. I suspect it's a walrus, an animal that comes up sea creature comes up on shore on Friday night on the Sabbath, stays on sand on the beach until the end of Saturday, and then goes back in the water and does this every week. And so it's almost like it's observing the Sabbath. So it's the Jewish fish. And I described it doesn't really have, it has paws like a frog, and it has a face like a calf. It sounds to me like a walrus sitting on the beach or something, or a seal. It's not really a seal. He talks about seals elsewhere, but clearly this clearly struck him as this kind of creature. And again, this is one of those things that I'm mentioning it, but one of those sort of like, okay, was this a story you heard? Was this something you saw personally, or this is just sort of like, here's a interesting animal I think you might find interesting in my readers. So yeah.
Do you plan to publish more on this work, other than the edition and the translation? Do you plan to work more on ajaib?
That would be, we'll see. I will.
Okay.
Let's finish this one first.
مستحق.
Yeah, maybe. Let's see. I mean, quite a bit has been written. I didn't mention, but I mean, this has never been translated into English. It's been translated at least twice into French, once into Spanish, part of it into Italian. But oddly, it seems to have been ignored. I mean, I don't see any other translations in English. So hoping glad LAL is going to change that.
I have a question. I'm just going to preface the question by saying that I'm not an expert in the field, but I was interested. You said with the names of the jinns, you said one of them was strange, or it was Hawaii, I think. Hawaii.
Yeah.
Why did you say that it was strange?
Not strange. Is that well? It's a name I didn't recognize. Where is it now? Here we go. Hawaii. It's like some of these others. I'm not sure what the actual meaning might be.
Okay.
One of the 4 manuscripts gives an alternate spelling, which is Hawaii, which would mean sort of like air, related to air, like it's an air jinn in the atmosphere, which would sort of go with these others, cloud jinns, wind jinns. But again, this might mean some delving into books on jinnology.
Yeah. I was just interested because so I'm a speaker of Urdu as well, and it's the same word. So I was just wondering, like, because you were saying this.
You have the word Hawaii? Is that a word in Urdu?
Yeah,
Hawaii.
Hawaii is the
Hawaii
word.
is air.
Hawaii, okay,
and Hawaii.
Yeah, but this is an odd, sort of unusual, and again, some of these like Dahadish, I mean, doesn't really mean anything to me, but it must mean something somewhere, or meant something at some point. So this means unusual word.
Yeah, I just wanna thank you very much for what you said. But this story about the creatures that come out on Saturdays and they disappear, they're mentioned in the Quran too. On this type of creatures that but they're described as hitan. Sorry, as hitan, which means like either fish or whale.
Yeah.
That would come every Saturday, and then this was like a challenge for the Jewish. Followers, I think of the Moses followers, if I'm not mistaken, and it was just like it is presented in the Quran as a challenge to the nation that was basically, and also probably as a ajiba, as you also have noticed, that they only do it on these particular days. So maybe there's some more information.
Thank you. That actually I never heard me. Yeah, I should take a look at that. Chronic reference to every time. Yeah. When I first read it, I was like, "This is bizarre. How do these animals know what day is Friday?" But apparently that seemed to be the idea, they come up once a week.
Maybe I just add
Yeah.
one more thing is that when they, like the way it's described in the Quran,
Mhm.
it didn't seem like they were weird creatures. It's just as if they every day they fish, but then when on that particular day the fish comes, the fish come in more in abundance on particular days. So maybe there's more information
So maybe
there.
that's okay, but yeah, certainly. Yeah, I mean, it's again, I will sort of take a look at that. It's really, thank you.
No problem.